These days, it seems everyone has a hot take on the supposed demise of the almighty dollar. From Liz Truss, the luckless former UK Prime Minister whose time at 10 Downing Street was roughly as lengthy as an English breakfast tea steeping, to the ominous rumblings of a return engagement for the chaos presidency of Donald Trump, prophets of dollar doom are legion. Yet for all the frenzied finger-wagging over inflation threatening American monetary credibility or the next Republican administration recklessly going full currency warrior to bludgeon the trade deficit, the dollar has thus far been remarkably unperturbed. Indeed, this venerable global reserve currency has a mulish tendency to strengthen in the very moments when breathless commentary insists it should be retreating into crisis. Call it the paradox of the perpetual dollar. At every ominous inflection point where the fundamentals argue that this time, surely, is the beginning of the end for the dollar's exorbitant privilege, the currency seems to dig in its heels with the stubbornness of an unkillable movie slasher villain. Just this week, an unexpectedly high inflation print led to a repricing of expected Federal Reserve rate cut timing, causing the dollar to rally as markets realigned with the prospects of tighter U.S. monetary policy for longer. A perfectly natural adjustment mechanism rooted in interest rate differentials between economies, the kind of thing one would expect to see for a currency whose global standing remained stubbornly intact. If skeptics were correct that U.S. authorities were truly losing their grip, allowing inflation accelerants to spiral out of control and shattering credibility in the Fed's stabilization regime, the dollar should be hollowing out, not muscling up. Capital should be seeking an exit from the very source of macroeconomic instability. Instead, the dollar appears to be acting like the ultimate safe haven in a global financial market buffeted by uncertainty. This fundamental resilience, it seems, is the thread that has run through episode after episode where armchair doomsayers prophesied the dollar's fall, only to be disappointed by its obstinate refusal to comply with their narrative. Who can forget the farcical thunder from the Trump White House about designating China a currency manipulator or renegotiating NAFTA to curtail Canadian tunnies from taking all our gerbs? Taken together, the administration's scattered broadsides were about as effective at debasing the dollar as tilting at windmills. Not only did the greenback end up appreciating during Trump's tenure, but research indicates his tariffs and general trade belligerence may have been responsible for as much as a fifth of that ascent by offsetting the lack of competitiveness inflicted on trade rivals. While one could point to Trump's lack of strategic purpose and economic illiteracy as factors limiting his efficiency at dislodging the dollar, the reality is that few predecessors have had much luck deliberately engineering currency weakness either. The Obama administration expended immense diplomatic energy imploring G20 partners to commit to restraining imbalances and forswearing competitive devaluations, only to be comprehensively rebuffed. This is the crux of the dollar's resilience paradox. On a conceptual level, we understand all the reasons why an unrestrained plunge in the currency's value would appear to be in America's strategic interests, not least to cheapen the cost of servicing the nation's prodigious external debts. As China's enormous dollar reserves make plain, persistent U.S. deficits have amounted to a perpetual wealth transfer from Americans to their creditors abroad, and yet the realities of the modern international order, the arresting depth of dollar financial plumbing running global payments infrastructure, the still unmatched scale and liquidity of U.S. capital markets, the lack of a genuine Swedish kroner and Swiss franc bilateral payment system between sovereigns to supersede the dollar, perpetually reassert the currency's centrality. For all its faults, as a vehicle for reserves, trade settlement, resource valuation, and cross-border funding, there is simply no real alternative institutional anchor at present. It is the very ubiquity and inertia of the existing dollar imperium, with all its vested interests and legacy practices, that seems to present such an immovable obstacle to transition and continually preserves the greenback's dominion in moments of weakness and doubt. Of course, we would be naive to assume the status quo is immutable. If the Biden administration's multi-trillion-dollar fiscal blowouts and protectionist economic management trigger a sudden, sharp erosion in the attractions of U.S. capital markets, that would be a different proposition entirely. Or heaven forfend, should a future Republican Congress truly consummate a good-faith default on Treasury debt while desperately trying to impose its unhinged ideological agenda on a Democratic president, the world's flight from dollar exposure could become a terrifying rout. but barring a ruinous confluence of malicious Republican stupidity and fiscal profligacy that destroys the very foundations of American economic credibility and capital market preeminence, most apparent threats to the dollar regime feel more like phantoms than substantive challenges. More often than not, they are symptomatic of the fevered dreams of inexpert currency warriors who struggle to grasp the deeper structural roots of the dollar system's persistence. Take the latest bouts of angst fixating on how a return of Trump, and with him the corrosive forces of economic nationalism, could catalyze this system's unraveling. The lurid fantasies anticipated involve hot-blooded demands from President Trump's dipstick advisors for the Federal Reserve to abandon its independence and actively pursue a weaker dollar through suppressed interest rates and direct currency intervention. In this scenario, we're meant to tremble at the prospect of Beltway arsonists openly compromising America's monetary integrity and stoking inflation for their cynical mercantile ambitions, triggering an exodus from a devalued U.S. unit. Foreign creditors with vast dollar exposures would scramble for the exits, while alternatives to the dollar system flowered in the wreckage. Yet we've seen this movie before. Trump may have periodically slagged the Fed chair. My only problem is he likes raising interest rates, a little too much, or groused about currency dynamics putting America at a disadvantage. But these were short-lived rhetorical crusades quickly abandoned in the vain hope of shaping a rally-stoking narrative before another scandal overwhelmed memory. And rhetoric that didn't remotely translate into policy. Far from trashing monetary credibility for some phantom trade war advantage, the Fed proceeded with its dual mandate under Trump, while the administration never advanced beyond some token currency grumbling about China and harmless bureaucratic tickling of the 2020 USMCA trade pact. As impotent as he was at dislodging Jerome Powell's stewardship of the Fed, Trump exhibited even less commitment or strategic coherence when it came to precipitating a currency imbroglio sufficient to threaten American systemically important status. And critically, there was never any evidence that the perils he conjured did more than marginally ruffle foreign confidence in the robustness of dollar plumbing. To the contrary, global capital seemed to greet each paroxysm from the Oval Office with a collective yawn about the fundamental continuity and institutional integrity of the republic's governance. Even those more persuasive skeptics who argue the dollar's defrocking is just a matter of time given America's long-term fiscal debauchery and dwindling economic centrality have to grapple with the perpetual obstacle of transitional inertia. It's perfectly plausible for armchair theorists to sketch a future where America's unchecked debts hollow out the attractiveness of U.S. assets, China's capital markets achieve depth and liquidity to rival Wall Street, and an upstart financial architecture centered on the yuan, crypto reserves, and non-dollar payments can overtake the reigning order. But more challenging is divining the spark that combusts the actual transition at a systemic level, setting ablaze investor portfolios, rerouting global transaction pipelines and supply chains, and necessitating the wholesale reconstruction of institutional financial infrastructure to avoid the economic black hole of a vacuum left by the imploding dollar system. After all, incumbency and legacy practices cast long shadows. Self-interested inertia is a perpetuating force of its own. And for all the thought experiments about someday relegating the dollar's dominance to the history books, clear off-ramps from its gravitational supremacy remain few and far between for the time being. As with any complex global architecture so deeply embedded, the transition risks may well deter precipitous abandonment barring a worst-case failure of American governance or fiscal credibility. So while history may judge the inordinate American privilege embodied in dollar hegemony as inexcusable, we inhabit a present where the imperium trundles onward, neither collapse nor systemic challengers imminent. Love it or lament it, the dollar abides as our monetary Grendel, an ancient and powerful force that even its detractors cannot dislodge for all their furious rhetoric. This is not to say the anxieties prodding the dollar skeptics are wholly misplaced. Indeed, in a nation that has toggled repeatedly between bitter partisan stalemates and ruinous bouts of debt-financed fiscal incontinence, one can scarcely blame the circumspect for wondering if we are ultimately sowing the seeds of our own financial downfall. After all, the governing classes that midwifed America's rise as a unipolar superpower bequeathed a matchless systemic advantage in the dollar's anointment as the fulcrum of the post-war economic order. Whether the architects of Bretton Woods were staking America's preeminence on prescient foresight or merely privileging their own provincial status as the last industrial power standing after World War II's devastations, the creation of a US-centric monetary system was a masterstroke that entrenched decades of American primacy. But that primacy, so long taken for granted by the ruling caste, feels increasingly imperiled in this disordered century. As the Cold War's rubble has cleared, peer rivals like China have gathered economic clout that the Dulles brothers and Henry Dexter White could scarcely have envisioned. The globalized interdependencies that yoked the world to American stewardship have begun to fray and splinter in the face of bitter geopolitics, disruptive technologies, and viral shocks. Most ominously, the great mercantile engine that generated so much of the wealth underwriting the dollar's exorbitant privilege has grown outwardly decrepit, hollowed by deindustrialization and the bicoastal rapacities of an inequitable education industrial 1%. Once the unrivaled economic juggernaut whose fiscal profligacy was easily papered over by the international capital flows created from dollar centrality, America has seemingly entered a more unsteady late phase of institutionalized decline. Much like the imperial purple twilight presaging Rome's long crumbling into ringed ramparts of ruin and the dusty intrigues of medieval cesspit towns, today's struggles with resurgent great power conflict, yawning savannah infrastructure nightmares, and compounded public health cataclysms do not bode well for Pax Americana's continuity. All this even before considering whether America's dysfunctional political institutions have finally ossified into a self-perpetuating caricature, immobilizing regeneration. Is it any surprise, given these myriad pressures, that grumblings would intensify over America's reserve currency stewardship? Beyond the economic illiterates who see currency wars as a magic talisman for restoring industrial glory days, a more substantive indictment persists that America's policy regimes have been short-sightedly rapacious in exploiting dollar primacy. In this narrative, the willingness of institutions like the Federal Reserve to backstop excessive Treasury borrowing simply enabled successive administrations to conduct fiscal policy that was the macroeconomic equivalent of lighting the nation's wealth on fire, consuming the seed corn of productivity while pushing debt service burdens onto future generations. Worse, the dollar's imperial privilege invited bipartisan cabals of mercantilists and protectionists to lard up American export competitiveness with barriers, secure in the knowledge that foreigner vendors could never credibly abandon the greenback con, even as they funded endless U.S. current account deficits that indenturing them to American monetary primacy. Yes, it's hard to look at trends like the Federal Reserve's balance sheet explosion or America's mushrooming net debtor status in the world and not feel a gnawing anxiety that the long-vanquished ghosts of Smoot and Hawley are being summoned back into the arena. With international monetary rules increasingly flouted and rival powers overtly challenging the legitimacy of the existing order, many serious-minded economists legitimately worry the edifice has begun to develop fissures destined to structurally fail. For those in this camp, the handwriting is already on the wall. America simply lacks the sustainable economic foundations to perpetuate dollar hegemony into coming generations. Not when the liabilities underwritten by decades of malfeasance have steadily compounded, while the engines of U.S. technological and industrial primacy have stalled or been offshored abroad. And not when the unchecked growth of populist ignorance, emboldened by the Internet's free-for-all infocalypse, has infected both the left and right with a paranoid conviction that the dollar architecture is little more than a rigged conspiracy to subsidize a bicoastal globalist elite's sellout to foreign powers. A political economy propelled by so much rot, this critique concludes, is destined to be violently rejected internally while hemorrhaging credibility externally among America's rivals and creditors. Better to begin contemplating the dissolution of the ancien regime before the tumbrils start rolling in earnest. This dystopian accounting of terminal American entropy makes for compelling doomsaying. But it fails to grapple with the obdurate realities that keep the dollar enshrined astride the international system, cyclically renewing confidence in its privileged dominion. For while the long arc of fiscal indiscipline, fraying political consensus, and sectarian feuding over economic orthodoxies may portend eventual ruptures, the inertial power of incumbency and the lack of viable institutional off-ramps conspire to preserve the dollar imperium from abrupt debasement. At least for now. At least for all the voices prophesying that this time, this crisis, this deficit deluge, this populist insurrection, will finally be the spark igniting the urgent reconstruction of a non-dollar international monetary architecture. Part of the dollar's defiant persistence, of course, stems from the enduring robustness of American capital markets and the sheer scale of dollar financial plumbing intertwined with every nook and crevice of the global economy. However uneven America's distribution of opportunity or sputtering its commercialization of emergent technologies, the NYSE continues to dwarf upstart pretenders to its liquidity supremacy. Banking titans from Wall Street to the City of London may face increasingly urgent competitive pressures from fintechs, spooked regulators, and rising Eastern peers. But the Anglosphere financial commons, steeped in common law, operating in the language of contracts and regulation, and grounded in reputations refined across centuries of commerce, remains the irreplaceable nucleus powering cross-border capital flows. So while prognosticators gaze toward a future where China's offshore yuan petromarks displace oil's traditional dollar pricing or some cryptocurrency succession inaugurates a borderless digital reset, the tyranny of path dependence imposes its gravitational restraints. As much as Beijing or Brussels dreams of a bipolar or tripolar dividing of financial spheres of influence, the world's whirling interdependencies resist a clean bifurcation when so many counterparties remain anchored to dollar footings. Indeed, the very immutability of the plumbing architecture preserving the dollar also ensures that few truly crave the Godzilla option of inadvertently imploding the whole system in a convulsion of schismatic chaos. As politically fraught as relations have grown between American and Chinese camps, neither wishes to be remembered for sparking an economically ruinous game of tone's downward spiral. Dollar supremacy persists, in part, because uncertainty about what follows counsels forbearance. When so many critical transactions and liabilities remain denominated in greenbacks, risking a system-wide credit event in pursuit of a fragmented new normal seems like the quintessential example of attempting to cross a chasm in two jumps. But that's not to say the guardrails, preserving dollar preeminence, will remain impregnable indefinitely. Just as the British pound's reign was once viewed as inviolable before the sceptred Isle's decline hastened its dethroning, so too is America's dollar privilege contingent on upholding fundamental precepts of sound finances and stewardship. Fissures are already visible in the bedrock assumptions pinning this intricate global architecture. Doubts seeded by post-crisis monetary experiments at the Fed and exacerbated by trillion-dollar force-feeding of pandemic stimulus into gaping maws of fiscal incontinence have stoked creeping worries about hyperinflationary conflagrations and financial disarray. Not to mention the sapping of market confidence from domestic political circus acts like the recurring debt ceiling brinkmanship and legislative constipation stifling investment and productive growth. If Washington cannot uphold sanctions regimes without leaving streamer trails of exemptions and carve-outs, at some point the enforceability of dollar primacy begins to degrade. Then fold in mounting challenges to dollar optionality from outside the gates. Resentment of frozen Russian forex reserves amidst the Ukraine conflagration has galvanized momentum for reserve asset diversification among erstwhile U.S. clients and satellites. Ditto for increasingly tendentious grievances over alleged American weaponization of the financial system to project foreign policy agendas at the expense of smaller sovereign stakeholders. While still sporadic, concerted defections from the dollar payments architecture have accelerated as multipolar antagonisms intensify. Saudi musings about accepting non-dollar payments for oil telegraphed an openness to breach the reserve regime's inner sanctum. Russia's pursuit of ruble-rupee energy barters, circumventing greenback clearinghouses, marks an incremental splintering path. On the frontiers of the digital asset insurgency, pilots for central bank digital currencies and crypto-reserve baskets, especially among dollar denial renegades like Iran and North Korea, signal that alternatives may coalesce if tipping points of dollar disillusion manifest. Already, digital nomads and libertarian freestaters point to the promise of money without boundaries as a hedge against their dystopian nightmares of creeping monetary statism and capital controls. Then there are the more grandiose ambitions for the yuan's ascension to co-equal status alongside the incumbent greenback, a project relentlessly pursued by Chinese mandarins. As America's industrial commons hollows out while Asia's mercantile juggernaut hums on, speculation inevitably eddies around whether the irrepressible economic gravities will ultimately favor the Middle Kingdom's unbridled currency over the dollar's dominion. Much like the recurring bouts of alarm over America's eroding economic ascendancy, these tremors may overstate immediate existential threats to the dollar. Greenbacks still denominate the vast majority of foreign reserves, compute international prices for industrial commodities, and serve as the vehicle for over half of all global commerce, even among non-Americans.